She took the job to find justice. She didn't expect to find him. Claire Whitmore was just a grieving widow until a silent corporate cover-up turned her sorrow into suspicion. Working as a temporary secretary at Hartwell Industries, she had one mission: expose the CEO she believed was responsible for her husband's death. But what happens when the man you came to destroy is nothing like you imagined? Why did Daniel Hartwell, a millionaire CEO with everything to lose, let her stay after catching her stealing confidential files? Why did his eyes reflect pain, not guilt? And when the truth finally surfaces, who will fall, who will be forgiven, and who might you come to love, even when you swore you never would? This is not just a story of revenge. It's a story of loss, truth, and the quiet, impossible road to healing. If you've ever carried a question that no one dared to answer, this story is for you. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Shining Stories for more powerful tales that stay with you long after they end. Now, let's begin. She thought no one would be in the office that late. She thought she had 10 quiet minutes to copy the files. She never expected the CEO himself to be standing behind her, watching in silence. The building had emptied out hours ago. Most of the lights were off, leaving only the soft glow from her desk lamp and the faint hum of machines on standby. Outside the windows, the sleepy town of Fairhaven was already winding down. Streetlights flickered through October mist, casting pale shadows across the floor. Inside, it was quiet except for the occasional creak of the heating system and the tapping of Claire's fingers against the keyboard. Claire Whitmore sat with her back straight, shoulders tense, her eyes flickering between the screen and the hallway beyond her cubicle. She wore a gray wool cardigan over a cream blouse, her hair pulled into a low bun that had started to loosen. Her hands were steady, but her stomach twisted with every click of the mouse. She knew what she was doing was wrong, but she also believed it was necessary. The folder she had found earlier that day, hidden beneath layers of digital mislabeling, contained a contract tied to the Hartwell Ridge project. She recognized the name immediately. That was the same project her late husband had worked on 2 years ago, the same one where safety violations were swept under the rug, the same one that had left her a widow before she turned 35. Now, a newer version of the contract had surfaced, and something about it felt off. Dates didn't align. Numbers were conveniently rounded, and one signature looked duplicated. She inserted a small USB drive into the back of the computer. It made a soft ding too loud in the silence. Just a few more seconds. Copy, drag, save. Her fingers moved with practiced caution, but her breath caught when she heard a sound behind her. A shift of air, a step. She froze, and then she felt it, that weight in the room. That presence. Turning slowly, her eyes met his. Daniel Hartwell stood in the hallway, his tall frame leaning lightly against the glass wall of her cubicle. His sleeves were rolled up, the top button of his white shirt undone. No blazer, no tie, just him, quietly watching her. There was no anger in his face, no accusation, just a kind of stillness that unnerved her more than yelling ever could. Claire stood up quickly, her hand reflexively moving to minimize the screen. But it was too late. "I didn't think anyone was still here," she said, her voice low, almost hoarse. She hated how small it sounded in that moment. Daniel didn't respond right away. He took a step closer, his shoes silent on the carpet. His gaze flicked briefly to the computer screen, then back to her face. "Neither did I," he said, voice calm and measured. Silence pressed between them again. Claire's heart pounded, echoing in her ears. She expected him to demand the USB, to fire her on the spot, maybe even call security. Instead, he surprised her. "Why don't you come into my office?" he said quietly. "Just for a minute." Claire hesitated. Every part of her told her to run, to make an excuse, fake a phone call, disappear. But instead, she nodded. Not because she trusted him, but because there was something in his voice that didn't feel like a trap. She followed him down the dim hallway, the sound of their steps the only thing breaking the hush of the night. His office door was already open. Inside, the room smelled faintly of cedar and old paper. The light from a small desk lamp cast warm shadows on the wooden bookshelves behind him. It wasn't the sleek, modern office she had imagined. It felt lived in. He gestured toward the leather chair across from his desk. She sat, gripping her purse tightly in her lap. He sat down too, not behind the desk, but across from her, close enough to read her face, but not enough to make her feel cornered. She kept her gaze steady, even as her hands curled into fists inside the sleeves of her cardigan. If this was the moment she got fired, she'd take it with her head held high. "I'm guessing you didn't come in tonight just to finish filing," he said gently. She didn't answer. "I don't need to know everything," he continued, "but I do want to know why." Claire blinked. For a second, she almost believed he sounded sincere, but she shook that thought off. This was a man trained to sound sincere. Still, something about his eyes made it hard to look away. Not sharp, not cold, just tired. She opened her mouth, but no words came. She wasn't ready to explain. Not to him. Daniel waited a few seconds longer, then stood slowly and walked to the desk. He reached into the top drawer, took out a small notepad, and scribbled something down. Tearing off the page, he folded it once and placed it on the table beside her. "We can talk more in the morning," he said. 9:00 a.m., I'll leave the door open." Claire stared at the folded paper, but didn't touch it. Then he nodded once, as if dismissing her. Not coldly, just giving her a way out. She stood, heart still thudding. As she walked past him, she paused. "I thought you'd be angrier," she said without turning around. He didn't respond for a moment. "Then, I'm many things. But angry doesn't help either of us tonight." Claire left his office feeling like she'd stepped out of one storm and into another. The hallway seemed longer than before. Her reflection in the glass was pale, her eyes wide, searching. She reached the front door, pushed it open, and stepped into the crisp night air. The wind smelled of salt and pine. Her chest ached with confusion. She had come here seeking answers, maybe even justice. But now, after standing across from Daniel Hartwell, she felt something she hadn't expected. Not forgiveness, not guilt, but curiosity. They say time heals, but it doesn't erase the questions, especially when the man you lost might have died because someone covered up the truth. 2 years earlier, the phone had rung at 6:12 in the morning. Claire remembered the number, but not the voice. She remembered the cold, though the way it crept into her skin, settled in her bones, stayed long after the call ended. Mark was gone. They said it was an accident, a collapse at a construction site, the Hartwell Ridge project. Steel gave way, safety cables failed, a section of the upper scaffold came down like a falling sky. Mark Whitmore was crushed before anyone could reach him. The official report said it was no one's fault, a freak failure, tragic, regrettable. The company paid for the funeral, sent flowers, and gave Claire a single-page settlement to sign. She never did. Then came the silence. No articles, no follow-ups, no names named. The news cycle skipped right over it. Even local reporters kept their distance. The project resumed a month later with a new team, and life around Fairhaven pretended nothing had happened. But Claire remembered everything. At first, grief numbed her. She walked through her days as if underwater, barely speaking, barely eating. Nights were worse long and hollow. The bed was too wide, the apartment too still. She'd sit at the kitchen table staring at the clock, waiting for a knock that would never come. Judith Owens was the one who kept her from unraveling completely. Judith had been her late mother's friend, the town's unofficial historian, and the head librarian at Fairhaven Public Library. A woman with soft gray hair always tied in a bun, a cardigan for every season, and eyes that saw more than most. She brought soup. She sat quietly. She asked no questions until Claire finally began to speak. "I don't believe it was an accident," Claire had whispered one evening, barely above the sound of the rain on the windows. Judith hadn't said, "You're imagining things," or "You need to let go." She just nodded slowly and poured more tea. From that night on, the grief turned into something else. Focus, purpose, quiet resolve. Claire wasn't just going to mourn Mark, she was going to understand why he never came home. Over the following year, she took night classes in accounting and project management. She brushed up her resume, built a cover story, and applied to dozens of administrative jobs. Eventually, Hartwell Industries called back. They were hiring a temporary executive assistant during a restructuring phase. 3 weeks, minimal background checks. It was enough. Now, sitting in her tiny apartment above the bakery, Claire stared at the folder on her laptop again. It was late, nearly midnight, but she couldn't sleep. Not after what happened earlier with Daniel, not with her head full of questions and her heart knotted from the confrontation. His voice still echoed in her memory, calm, controlled. Why? That was all he had asked. Not what, not how, but why. She had no answer that could satisfy a man like him. Not yet. She turned back to the computer, brows furrowing as she opened the folder she had copied earlier. It was buried deep 4 layers down in a maze of shared company drives. A single Excel file with a vague title, Legacy, Reports, OSFH, Zip. She clicked it. A password prompt appeared. Claire exhaled slowly. Of course. It wouldn't be that easy. She didn't know why she tried random guesses Mark's name, project numbers, even acronyms from old documents she'd reviewed. Nothing worked. She leaned back, rubbing her temples, staring at the blinking cursor. It wasn't just the password that frustrated her. It was the implication. Someone had hidden this. Someone wanted it buried. And the fact that it referenced Legacy and FH made her stomach twist. FH, Fairhaven, or maybe Hartwell. She opened her notebook and jotted down a few ideas. A new list of things to try. She wasn't done. The truth was close. She could feel it like a storm on the horizon just beyond reach, but too loud to ignore. The next morning, she had planned to walk away, to pack her things and disappear before Daniel could ask more questions. But now, looking at that encrypted file, something inside her shifted. She couldn't leave. Not yet. Too much had been silenced. Too many things unsaid. Mark's death hadn't been random. She felt it in her bones, the same way she had felt the air go still just before the officer knocked on her door 2 years ago. Claire got up, crossed the room, and pulled open the drawer where she kept Mark's old things. His watch, his pocket notebook, the pen he always clipped to his shirt. She ran her fingers over the leather strap, now worn and cracked. It still ticked faintly. Somehow, "I'm not done," she whispered to the dark room. Not until she knew what happened. Not until someone said his name out loud again and told the truth. Even if that truth led straight to the man who, tonight, had looked her in the eyes and said he wanted to talk. He wasn't what she expected. No arrogance, no rehearsed charm. Just a tired man with quiet eyes and a coffee mug that said, "World's okayest CEO." Claire stood outside Daniel's office, her hand hovering for a moment before she finally knocked. It was just after 9. The sky outside was overcast, the kind of dull gray that made the ocean look like brushed steel. She hadn't slept much. Her mind had spun all night replaying every word, every glance from the night before. The door creaked open almost immediately. Daniel was already standing by the window, sleeves rolled up, tie absent. His shirt was slightly wrinkled, as if he'd slept in it. On the table beside him was a small French press, half full, and a chipped mug that looked wildly out of place in the sleek glass and wood office. "Good morning," he said simply, and gestured toward the chair across from his. Claire stepped in slowly, unsure of what tone this meeting would take. She braced for questions, interrogation, suspicion, perhaps even quiet threats. But none came. Daniel poured himself another cup of coffee, then offered her one. She declined with a shake of her head. "I only drink tea," she said softly, voice still a bit raw. He smiled faintly. "My mother used to say coffee was for people who couldn't sit still with their own thoughts." He stirred the coffee absent-mindedly, then leaned back on the edge of his desk. Not behind it, he hadn't taken the position of power. Claire noticed that. "I've been going through the financials," he said, "and something doesn't add up." Her breath caught in her chest. So, this was it. He had seen the files. But he didn't mention her copying anything, didn't bring up USB drives or computer logs. Instead, he slid a printed spreadsheet across the desk toward her. "The last audit was rushed. I had questions, and I didn't get answers." He continued, "I've noticed certain transfers being mislabeled, amounts shifted between internal budgets that don't match their timestamps. You've worked with procurement reports lately. Did you see anything strange?" Claire blinked. He was asking her opinion, not accusing, not deflecting, asking. She took the paper slowly, letting her eyes move down the numbers. They were close, very close to the file she had tried to copy, but different enough that he might not yet know the whole picture. "I noticed some files were inconsistent," she said carefully. "Dates didn't match internal memos. Some vendor names were off." Daniel nodded, like he'd expected that. "You know, I didn't want this job," he said, almost as an afterthought. Claire looked up. "My father built this company, worked his way up from nothing. People called him a visionary, but he also cut corners, took risks, believed in results over everything else." He sipped his coffee, letting the silence stretch. "I wanted to teach high school English, if you can believe it. I got my degree, even taught for a year in Vermont. But when my father got sick, I came home. I thought I'd fill in for a few months. It's been 12 years. Claire studied him. There was a worn quality to his voice, not defeated, but weathered. Not the rehearsed charm of a man trying to save face, but the slow unfolding of someone who no longer needed to perform. "And your father?" she asked, surprising herself. He gave a slow nod. "Died 3 years ago. Cancer. I took over a mess." He left a powerful legacy, but not all of it clean. "I've spent the last few years untangling contracts, trying to rebuild trust from the inside out." Another pause. He looked at her, then really looked, not with suspicion, with something softer, human. "I don't know why you're here," he said. "Not really, but you seem determined. And if you're looking for the truth, so am I." Claire didn't know what to say. Her entire plan had been built on the idea that Daniel was the enemy, the figurehead of a company that buried evidence, hid behind PR, and let good men like Mark die without accountability. But the man sitting in front of her now didn't look like a villain. He looked tired and honest, and maybe, just as lost in all this as she was. He finished his coffee and set the mug aside. Then he leaned forward, elbows on knees, hands clasped. "I'm not going to stop you from digging," he said quietly. "Whatever it is you're after, but if you find something real, I want to be the first to know." The words settled like a stone in her chest. Not heavy in a bad way, just grounding. She had expected confrontation, manipulation. Instead, she'd been given permission. And more than that, a strange, disarming form of respect. Claire nodded once, unable to form words. Daniel stood, smoothing the front of his shirt, already turning to reach for a folder on the shelf. The meeting, apparently, was over. She rose too, more slowly. Her hand touched the door handle, but she paused. There was something about the way his eyes didn't flinch, the way he didn't try to explain or justify, just invited her into the mess, as if he believed she might be the one to help him sort it. Outside the office, the world resumed as usual, phones ringing, keyboards clacking, sunlight stretching across the atrium floor. But something had shifted in her. Claire had come here expecting a fight. But instead, she was leaving with a question she hadn't thought to ask. What if he wasn't the one she needed to destroy? Sometimes the truth doesn't shout. It hides in numbers, in memos, in silences. Claire sat hunched over her desk, long after most employees had packed their bags and left for the day. The only light in the office came from her screen. its soft glow painting shadows across her face. Her fingers moved across the trackpad with a quiet rhythm, not hurried, but deliberate, like someone weaving a thread through scattered pieces of cloth, trying to make sense of a pattern. She had begun with the procurement reports, then old payroll ledgers, then timestamps from building maintenance logs. The more she pulled, the more tangled the threads became, but not in the way she had expected. The discrepancies didn't point toward Daniel. In fact, his name rarely showed up at all. Instead, the trail led to someone else, Lucas Granger. She had seen the name once before, tucked away in a footnote on a 2-year-old org chart. Former chief financial officer. Resigned quietly 6 months before Mark's accident. No press release, no farewell. Now his name was showing up in buried email chains, irregular sign-offs, and financial approvals that had since been overwritten. And there was something else, a folder marked Project Realignment, Archive, hidden in a legacy server. The folder had no recent access date, as if it had been locked and forgotten. But inside it was a spreadsheet of cost projections, and Claire's stomach turned as she read the names of subcontractors, including the one responsible for the scaffold that failed. None of it was proof, not yet, but it was enough to make her chest feel tight. She leaned back, closed her eyes for a moment, and let the hum of the building settle around her. For a brief second, she thought she heard laughter echoing faintly from the stairwell. She turned and looked through the glass. Down below, in the warehouse section connected to the back of the main building, a few lights were still on. And then she saw him, Daniel. He was in jeans and a navy sweatshirt now, sleeves pushed up, standing beside a stack of storage boxes. Next to him, a middle-aged man in a wrist brace was trying to lift a heavy cart. Claire watched as Daniel bent down, gently moved the man's hands away, and began stacking the boxes himself. No fuss. No audience, just quiet help. He moved with practiced ease, lifting, shifting, adjusting. She could tell this wasn't a performance. It wasn't for show. She stayed watching longer than she meant to, not because it changed anything she knew, but because it complicated everything she thought she understood. He could be hiding something, or he could be the only one trying to make it right. Back at her desk, Claire reopened the system logs. There was still one piece missing, something that had been bothering her since she started noticing the overwritten reports. She dug deeper, into archived meetings. Most were clean, dated, indexed, brief, but one entry caught her eye. A video file labeled Quarterly Dev Sync, Q3. It was dated 2 weeks after Mark's death, yet marked as Q2 in the folder structure. It shouldn't have existed, not with that timestamp. Her heart pounded. She opened the file. The image quality was grainy, as if compressed multiple times. The camera angle was static, pointed at a long glass table in a conference room she didn't recognize. Daniel was there, seated at the far end. Around him were 6 other executives, one of whom she now recognized as Lucas Granger. The audio crackled, but the tension in the room was unmistakable. Daniel's voice was firm, controlled, but there was something in it, a quiet frustration. I'm not signing off on this. Hartwell Ridge needs a full safety reevaluation before Phase 2. Period. Lucas leaned forward, tapping the table. That's not your call, Dan. The board already approved the continuation. Pulling back now makes us look uncertain. Daniel didn't flinch, then let us look uncertain, because pushing forward without a second structural review is reckless. We already lost someone. I'm not risking another life for the sake of schedule. The room fell silent. The clip ended abruptly. Claire sat frozen, the air around her suddenly cold. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, uncertain of their next move. It wasn't just that Daniel had objected, it was that someone had tried to bury his objection. By changing the file name, by mislabeling the quarter, by hiding it behind layers of bureaucratic fog. And the man sitting across from him, the one arguing to push forward, was the same man whose name kept surfacing in financial anomalies. Lucas Granger. Claire's breath caught. Her chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with anger, because this wasn't the story she came for. She wasn't staring at a corrupt CEO with blood on his hands. She was staring at the possibility that Daniel had tried to stop it, that he might have failed, but not out of negligence, out of being outnumbered. She logged off, closed the files, shut the laptop with a trembling hand. She made it to her car before the tears came. Not loud, not messy, just quiet streaks down her cheeks as she sat behind the wheel, keys in her lap, headlights reflecting faintly off the wet pavement. The truth was supposed to bring clarity, but this truth only made things harder, because now she didn't know where her anger belonged. She didn't know who to fight anymore, or whether she was even ready to stop fighting. She came here to expose him, not to find herself leaning toward him, not to feel safer when he smiled. The rain had started just before dusk, sweeping in from the coast like a slow-moving curtain. It pattered against the tall windows of the Hartwell building, smudging the city lights and turning the glass into watercolor. Claire hadn't noticed it at first. She was too deep in the data again, digging through archived HR reports, watching for patterns that had long been buried. She looked up only when a soft knock touched the edge of her awareness. Daniel stood at the entrance of her workspace, holding 2 cups of something that steamed gently into the cool air. His shirt sleeves were rolled, his hair slightly tousled. There was something in his posture, half smile. One brow lifted that wasn't formal, just human. "You're still here," he said quietly. Again. Claire leaned back in her chair. "Just finishing up?" He walked over and placed one of the cups on her desk without asking. "It's chamomile. Figured coffee would be cruel at this hour." She hesitated, then wrapped her hands around the warmth. "Thanks." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It felt soft. The way rain sounds when it fills all the empty space between thoughts. "I can give you a ride," he said. "It's coming down harder than they forecasted. Roads out of Fairhaven get messy fast." Claire looked out the window. He was right. The streets were already shimmering with water, the gutters overflowing. She almost said no. Almost. But then she nodded. They didn't speak much in the elevator. The soft ding of each floor seemed louder than usual, and she couldn't stop noticing how close they stood, shoulder to shoulder, yet careful not to touch. It wasn't tension, it was awareness. That quiet awareness that lingers between people who've begun to see each other differently. Daniel's car smelled faintly of cedar and old leather. Classical music played low, barely audible under the hum of the heater. He drove without rush, one hand steady on the wheel, eyes scanning the rain-soaked road with calm focus. They were halfway through the old logging road when the headlights caught a fallen tree and a wash of mud across the pavement. Daniel braked gently. The tires slid slightly before gripping again. "Well," he said, almost amused, "I guess that's our cue." He pulled to the side, where an old wooden porch stood crookedly under a slanted roof, the remnants of a once-inhabited cabin. The place looked forgotten, but the porch still offered shelter. They ran the short distance, Claire holding her coat above her head. The rain soaked her anyway, hair clinging to her face, droplets trailing down her neck. They stepped under the awning, both catching their breath. She laughed softly, surprising herself. "Didn't picture this part of my evening," she said. Daniel looked at her, his own hair damp, a bead of water rolling down his temple. "Me neither." There was no electricity, but the sky gave just enough glow to see each other. They stood in silence, the only sound being the steady rhythm of the rain hitting the tin roof above. It was a sound that filled the soul, a sound that made you remember things you didn't want to forget. Claire wrapped her arms around herself and leaned against the porch post. Daniel sat down on the edge of a broken bench, fingers loosely laced, elbows on knees. "I used to come out here with my mother," he said, almost to the air, "before everything became responsibility." Claire glanced at him. "You mentioned her before. She was the first person who ever told me I didn't have to be my father." He said, "Back then, I thought that was a compliment. Now, I think it was a warning." He didn't say more. He didn't have to. Claire stepped closer, slowly, as if the rain had softened her edges. "She must have loved you a lot." Daniel nodded. "She did. She also knew I'd get lost in things that looked like duty, but were really shame in disguise. Claire felt something shift inside her. A door, long locked, creaking open. "My husband," she began, voice quiet, wasn't supposed to be on site that day. He was covering for someone else. He didn't even tell me until the morning of. I told him to be careful. I always told him that. It was the last thing I ever said to him. She didn't cry. The tears had come and gone years ago, but the ache in her chest was sharp and present. Daniel didn't offer comfort. He didn't reach out. He simply looked at her with eyes that said, "I'm here. I'm listening." That was more powerful than any touch. A long silence passed. The rain softened, tapering into a mist that whispered against the trees. Claire realized then, in that quiet pocket of time, that she didn't feel watched or judged or unsafe. She felt safe, and that terrified her. She looked at Daniel and saw not the CEO, not the man she came to investigate, not even the grieving son or the reluctant leader. She saw someone human, flawed, trying, and for the first time, her heart moved in a direction her mind told it not to. "I'm feeling something that's not right. Not now, not with him." The moment passed like mist lifting. Daniel stood and offered his coat without a word. She took it, draping it over her shoulders. They walked back to the car in silence, their breaths fogging in the cool night. He didn't ask her anything, didn't suggest another conversation. Just drove her home, the wipers a steady metronome of unspoken thoughts. When they reached her place, he didn't follow her to the door. He waited until she stepped inside, nodded once through the window, and pulled away. Claire leaned against the inside of her door, heart still tangled in things she didn't want to name. Then she saw it, a plain white envelope, tucked neatly at the foot of her door. No stamp, no markings, just her name in block letters. She bent down, picked it up with cautious fingers, and opened it. Inside were 2 photographs. One showed her and Daniel standing under the awning, soaked, close, mid-laughter. The other was from earlier inside the office, Daniel handing her the cup of tea. On the back, written in red ink, "Sleeping with the enemy." Claire's knees gave slightly. Someone was watching. Someone wanted to remind her of the line she wasn't supposed to cross, and that maybe she already had. Falling for someone you came to destroy isn't just foolish, it's terrifying. Claire hadn't slept. The envelope still lay on her kitchen table, its contents spread open like a wound she couldn't close. The photos, the message, the implication. Her heart had thudded with quiet panic all night, her ears tuned to every creak, every shadow. Someone was watching her, someone new, but who she wanted to believe it wasn't Daniel. She needed to believe it. But the part of her shaped by loss, by betrayal, by Mark's silence that never had an answer, that part wasn't ready. So, the next morning, she told herself she'd keep her distance. She showed up to work with practiced calm, ready to hide behind polite smiles and locked drawers. But the moment she stepped into the building, Daniel was already waiting by the front entrance. No briefcase, no laptop, just him, his expression unreadable, eyes steady. "I think you should come with me," he said. She froze. Why? He didn't answer, just stepped aside, opened the car door, and waited. And somehow, Claire followed, no questions, no accusations, just quiet trust wrapped in uncertainty. They drove out of town past the marina, past the cliffs, deep into the forest roads that curved like whispers through trees. Neither of them spoke. The silence between them wasn't hostile. It was heavy. Yes, but not from distance, from all the things they hadn't said yet. After an hour, they turned onto a gravel path, barely visible beneath overgrowth. At the end of it stood a small cabin, perched beside a still lake. The kind of place that felt like it had forgotten time. Weathered wood, a crooked chimney, shutters that hung slightly off hinge, but it breathed peace. Daniel cut the engine. The quiet that followed was complete. "This place belonged to one of my mother's oldest friends," he said, finally breaking the silence. She passed last spring. I've kept the cabin up since. Claire stepped out slowly. The air was different here, thicker with pine and moisture. The lake glistened in the distance, motionless beneath a sky of muted gray. No cars, no hum of life, just wind and water and the quiet breath of nature. Inside, the cabin was simple. One large room with an open kitchen, a fireplace framed by river stones, and two faded armchairs facing the lake. A quilt draped over the back of the couch, smelling faintly of cedar and lavender. A few books lay scattered, as if someone had been here recently, but not often. Daniel poured tea in the kitchen while Claire wandered slowly, fingertips brushing the edge of the mantel, the worn spines of books, the brass knob on the window latch. "I saw your face this morning," Daniel said, softly. "I don't know what happened, but I know fear when I see it." Claire didn't answer. She didn't know how. He handed her the cup gently, then sat across from her on the low step beside the fireplace. His gaze didn't press. It waited. After a while, he said, "I think Lucas is still around." Her head snapped up. "I don't have proof," Daniel continued, "but files go missing. Passwords are reset. Projects rerouted. It's subtle, but it's his style. Create cracks in the foundation, and then disappear before anyone notices the structure's failing." Claire's fingers tightened around the cup. "So, why don't you go after him?" Daniel looked down at his hands. "Because going after ghosts is easy. Building something better in their place that's harder. And I don't want this company to be about revenge. Not anymore." Claire didn't know what to do with that. Her own life had become a chase, a hunt for answers, for blame, for clarity. Could she even imagine what it meant to build something after evening began to settle over the cabin like a soft blanket? Daniel lit a few oil lamps, their golden glow casting shadows that flickered along the walls. "I'll sleep on the couch," he said simply, already unfolding a blanket. Claire nodded, thankful he didn't offer more. Later, long after he'd fallen asleep, Claire stepped outside onto the small porch. The wood creaked softly under her feet. The lake reflected stars like scattered glass, and a breeze kissed her cheeks with the kind of chill that made her wrap her arms tighter. She sat on the porch step, warm mug in hand, knees pulled close. Her breath fogged in the air, and for the first time in years, she wasn't thinking about Mark, not as a wound, not as a ghost. She was thinking about Daniel, about the way he didn't push, about how he made tea instead of speeches, about how he saw her, really saw her, and never once asked her to be anyone else. And that terrified her, because trusting him meant letting go of something she had carried like armor. A quiet shuffle behind her made her turn. Daniel stood in the doorway, blanket around his shoulders, barefoot. "I couldn't sleep," he said. She looked away. "Me neither." He sat beside her without asking. The night stretched long around them. Trees swayed in the distance, wind whispering through their branches like old secrets. Claire didn't speak, but her hands trembled slightly as she held the mug. She set it down, stared out at the lake. Daniel's voice broke the stillness. "If one day," he said gently, "you decide to leave, without a word, without an explanation, I'll understand." Claire didn't move. "I know I might always be the man tied to a company that took too much from you," he continued, "and I know you may never trust me completely. You don't have to. I just needed to say I won't ask for more than you can give." His voice didn't crack, but something in it bent, like a tree under wind, not breaking, just yielding. Claire's throat tightened. Her eyes burned not from sadness, but from something she couldn't name. She didn't cry for Mark. Not this time. She cried for Daniel, for the man who never asked her to forgive him, but quietly offered her peace anyway. She thought the past had been buried, but some ghosts don't stay quiet, especially the ones wearing tailored suits. Claire stepped out of the coffee shop just after 4 p.m. Her coat wrapped tight against the biting ocean breeze. The air smelled of wet pavement and the sharp salt of the tide pushing in. She was on her way back to the office, heart pounding for reasons she couldn't entirely name. She had made a decision. She would tell Daniel everything. The photos, the folder Lucas had hidden, her doubts, her fears, even the part of her that had begun to feel something more. But the moment she stepped into the parking lot, she knew something was off. He was leaning against her car, casual, like an old friend waiting with good news. Except there was nothing warm in his posture, only precision, and something colder than the wind slicing through her coat. Tall, trim, impeccably dressed in a dark wool coat over a charcoal suit. The lines of his jaw were sharp, too clean, like they'd been etched into place. A cigarette smoldered between two fingers, its scent bitter and stale. Claire slowed her steps. "Ms. Whitmore," the man said smoothly, "it's been hard to find you." She said nothing, just met his gaze with the quiet caution of someone approaching a snake coiled in the grass. "I'm Lucas Granger," he offered, as if the name needed no introduction. "We have a few overlapping interests." The air between them thickened. Up close, she could see his eyes pale blue, like cracked ice under thin glass. Not kind, not cruel, just utterly indifferent, as if he'd weighed 1,000 people before her and found them all equally disposable. "What do you want?" she asked quietly. He took a slow drag of his cigarette, then flicked the ash to the side without breaking eye contact. "Information, truth, survival. You pick the word that makes you feel most comfortable." She didn't answer. Her fingers itched toward the keys in her coat pocket, but she knew better than to turn her back. Lucas stepped closer, the scent of cold smoke and expensive cologne trailing after him. "I know you've been spending quite a bit of time with Daniel," he said, "under his wing, so to speak. Cute, really, very PR redemption arc." Claire's jaw tightened. "He's not who you think," Lucas continued. "He plays the long game. Always has. You're just a piece on the board." Her heart pounded, but her face remained still. "Let me guess," he said, voice low. "He told you he wanted to fix his father's mistakes, that he's nothing like the man who built this empire. Let me tell you something. Claire Daniel didn't fall into that chair. He crawled his way to it, over bodies, over people like your husband." She flinched, just slightly, enough for him to see. Lucas smiled. "Did he tell you he signed off on Phase 1 of Hartwell Ridge personally? That he pushed for expedited permits? That the delay he argued for in that little meeting video was already 2 weeks too late?" Her stomach twisted. Or maybe he left that part out. He pulled a small USB drive from his coat pocket and held it between two fingers. "This has the full project timeline, internal memos, email chains, contracts, everything you need to see him for what he really is." Claire didn't move. "Of course," he said, stepping even closer, "you could always choose the other version of the story. The love-struck assistant who got too close, too blind, too compromised." From his other pocket, he pulled a small manila envelope. She didn't have to look inside. She knew what was in there. Photos, the ones from the porch, from the office, from the quiet places no one should have seen. Lucas didn't hand it to her. He simply let it hover in the air, like a promise or a threat. "You help me expose him," he said, "or these go where they need to go. The press loves a scandal, especially one where the CEO's mistress turns out to be his shield." Claire's breath caught. Fury swelled in her chest, but so did something darker, fear. Not for herself, for Daniel, for what this would do, and for the terrible possibility that Lucas might not be lying. She reached out slowly, took the USB. He gave a mock bow. Smart girl. Claire turned without a word, got into her car, started the engine, backed out of the parking lot with slow, deliberate hands, but she didn't drive away. Not yet. She pulled into the empty overlook by the edge of the cliff, facing the endless gray sea. The wind howled against the windows, rattling them softly. Waves crashed below, steady and wild. She held the USB in one hand, the manila envelope in the other. Her breath shook. Lucas's voice still echoed in her ears. "You're just a piece on the board." Was she? Or had she willingly walked onto the board, believing she could play by her own rules? She didn't know anymore, but she knew one thing. Something inside her had changed. And that change, whether love, guilt, or truth, was no longer hers alone to carry. She had come to spy, to dig, to destroy. Now she stood outside his door, holding nothing but the truth. It was nearly dusk when Claire pulled into Daniel's driveway. The porch light glowed amber through the early fog, casting soft halos against the falling night. The world was quiet, as if holding its breath. So was she. Her hand hovered above the doorbell for a long time. She wasn't sure what she feared more, what she was about to say, or what might come after. The door opened before she could ring. Daniel stood there in a dark sweater and jeans, barefoot, as if he'd just walked in from a long day and hadn't expected company. Their eyes met. No words. Just the kind of silence that asks 1,000 questions all at once. "I need to talk," Claire said, her voice barely above a whisper. He stepped aside, letting her in without hesitation. Inside, the house was dim, lit only by the soft glow of a lamp in the corner and the crackling fire in the hearth. Everything felt muted shadows folded into furniture. Time slowed down. Claire sat on the edge of the couch. Daniel took the armchair across from her. A coffee table stood between them, but it may as well have been miles of unspoken history. She held the USB drive in her hand, fingers tightening around its edges. "I came here," she began, voice tight, "to find someone to blame." Daniel didn't move. She looked down. After Mark died, nothing made sense. No answers, no accountability, just silence. And then I found out Hartwell Industries had touched the project. Her voice broke a little. "I thought, if I could find something, anything, maybe I'd understand why." She laid the USB on the table, so I applied, got hired, started watching, digging. I copied files, hid notes. I didn't trust anyone. Daniel's expression didn't change, but the silence around him deepened. "I didn't trust you," she continued. "I thought you were cold, calculated. I thought everything kind you did was part of a performance." The words were heavier than she expected. Speaking them aloud made them real, made the guilt burn sharper behind her ribs. But then, she said, softer now, "You weren't, not always. You listened, you helped, you didn't push." She swallowed, and that made it harder. Outside, the wind moved through the trees like a slow tide, brushing the windows with its rhythm. Claire reached for her cup of tea, only to realize she hadn't even touched it. Her hands trembled slightly. She set the cup back down. "I got this yesterday," she said, sliding the manila envelope forward. "Photos. From someone I think you know, Lucas Granger." At the name, Daniel's jaw tensed, a flicker in the eyes, then stillness again. "He told me I was just a pawn," she said, "that you've been playing me this whole time." And for a moment, I didn't know what to believe. Daniel leaned back in his chair, hands clasped, eyes fixed on nothing. The room felt full and yet empty, like something sacred was about to shatter. And then, after a long stretch of stillness, he looked at her. His voice was calm, but beneath it, a thread of something deeper, something raw. "Did you ever trust me?" he asked. Even just for a moment, Claire's breath caught. It was not a demand, not an accusation. It was a question wrapped in quiet ache, and it pierced deeper than if he'd raised his voice. She opened her mouth to answer, but nothing came, not because the answer was no, but because it was no longer simple. Trust had crept in when she wasn't looking, when he handed her tea, when he listened without interrupting, when he sat beside her in silence under the rain. It had grown not from certainty, but from something gentler shared wounds, quiet gestures, and still. She hadn't been ready to give it a name. Daniel stood, crossed the room slowly. He picked up the USB, turned it in his hand once, then placed it back down. "I don't need you to defend me," he said quietly, "but I won't hide. Not from you." Claire felt the tightness in her chest loosen just slightly. He looked at her again, and this time, his voice held no ache, just choice. If you need to walk away, do it. If you need time, take it. He stepped back, but if you stay, he said, we fight this together. There were no grand declarations, no embraces, just a line drawn not between them, but ahead of them, an invitation, a beginning. Claire sat there long after Daniel had gone upstairs, staring into the fire as the logs cracked and shifted, and for the first time since Mark's death, she felt the weight of truth not as punishment, but as release. The headlines weren't just ink on paper. They were knives, and they cut deep. Claire opened her eyes to the sound of her phone vibrating again. At first, she thought it was a wrong number, a robocall, something trivial. But the moment she reached over and saw the screen flooded with notifications, text messages, emails, missed calls, her stomach turned to stone. The first article had gone live at dawn. She didn't even need to read it. The headline alone was enough to pull the floor from beneath her feet. Whistleblower secretary and the CEO? Affair. What are they hiding in the Hartwell scandal? Below it, a photo of her and Daniel standing close outside the cabin. Claire's face soft, open, Daniel looking down at her like he might have said something kind, private. A second image followed her exiting his home late at night, the glow of porch light catching the curve of her cheek. Zoomed, cropped, weaponized. The air in her lungs turned jagged. She clicked on the article with shaking fingers. The content was a blend of half-truths and outright lies, claims of coordinated deception, accusations of hush money, implications that Claire was planted to distract from a brewing financial crime. They had twisted everything, made her grief a punchline, her search for truth, a seduction. The worst part wasn't the article itself. It was the comments. Typical gold digger. She played the widow card well. How much did she make to stay quiet? Of course he picked her. She looks like someone who'd keep secrets. Each word carved a deeper line. The world she'd tried to navigate carefully with silence, with dignity, was now ripping at the seams. And she was at the center of the storm, without shelter, without defense. Her phone kept ringing, numbers she didn't recognize, news outlets, former colleagues. One even claimed to be from a morning show. Just a quick interview to set the record straight, as if anything could be made straight again. She turned the phone off. By the time noon came, the damage had reached full velocity. Hartwell Industries became a trending topic. TV anchors speculated. Financial analysts panicked. The stock price plunged in real time. Daniel hadn't been seen since the night before. He didn't come to the office. He didn't call. A temporary leave of absence was announced, pending internal review. They said, and Claire? Claire was relieved of her duties until the matter is clarified. That phrase stayed with her, over and over again. Relieved of her duties, like she had been a burden, like she'd done something shameful, like her presence was the problem. She sat on her living room floor, legs folded, knees drawn in, the blinds were half shut, the light outside pale and cold. Her tea had gone cold hours ago. She hadn't eaten. The quiet wasn't peace. It was punishment. Every few minutes, her laptop pinged with another alert, a headline, a blog post, someone reposting old pictures of Mark tragic widow turns traitor. A phrase that made her heart seize. She stared at the screen, then shut the laptop. There was nothing left to read. Everything she'd built her fragile sense of progress. The tender hope she hadn't dared name with Daniel. The long journey toward healing. It all now lay in shards around her. Tears didn't come right away. They arrived late, soft. As if her body had fought them and lost. She wasn't crying for what the world thought. She was crying for what she might lose. For the quiet truth between her and Daniel, something honest, something trying, and for the fear that it might not survive this. The knock at the door startled her. For a moment, she couldn't move. Then, slowly, she rose, hands trembling, and opened it. Judith stood there, hair tucked into a scarf, a canvas bag slung over her shoulder. She looked like she hadn't slept either, but her eyes were steady. Without a word, she stepped inside and wrapped Claire in a long, firm hug. It was the first human touch Claire had felt all day, and it broke something open. She cried this time with sound, with the kind of trembling that came from the deepest part of her chest. Judith said nothing, just held her until the storm passed. When they finally sat down, Judith reached into her bag and pulled out a small plastic case. Inside was a micro SD card, dusty, scratched, old. This was in one of Mark's old camera cases. She said, "I never thought anything of it, but I remembered him saying he kept backups for just in case. I thought maybe—" Claire took it slowly. "What is it?" Judith hesitated. "I don't know. But it's labeled with the Ridge Project name." Claire's fingers closed around it like it was glass. Her breath hitched. "Maybe it's nothing," Judith said gently. "But maybe it's something you weren't meant to find." The sun had started to fall by then, casting long shadows across the room. Claire stared at the card, her reflection flickering in the tiny plastic window. Maybe it was nothing. But if it was something real, something Mark had seen, then it wasn't just evidence. It was a gift, a message, a thread of truth he'd tried to leave behind. And now, it was in her hands. Her heart steadied for the first time that day. She stood, wiped her face, and crossed the room to her laptop. The world could say what it wanted. Let them write their headlines. Let them spin their stories. She knew the truth hadn't finished speaking yet. And now, she finally had something to say back. The truth doesn't roar. It walks in, quietly, and stays. Claire hadn't expected him to call back. Not after everything. But that morning, just after sunrise, her phone lit up with a number she didn't recognize, but she knew. It was Daniel. He didn't say much, just that there would be a shareholders meeting that evening, public, televised, streamed live. And if she wanted to come, she should. She dressed in silence, no makeup, no jewelry, just a dark blue sweater and black slacks. Something quiet, something grounded. Her hands trembled when she placed the micro SD card into the small envelope, and even more so when she slipped it into her coat pocket. It didn't feel like a weapon. It felt like a key. Outside the Hartwell Industries building, cameras swarmed the front steps, protesters with signs, supporters with hopes, skeptics with questions. Claire didn't walk through the front door. She entered from the side, her badge still active. Someone hadn't revoked it yet. The elevator ride up was quiet, the mirrored walls reflecting a face she was still learning to recognize, someone broken, rebuilt, and breaking again. The boardroom was full by the time she arrived. Not just executives and shareholders, but media, live streams, reporters in tailored blazers, the soft hum of broadcast equipment filling the air. The space smelled like too much perfume and nervous sweat. Someone whispered her name when she walked in. Others looked away. Claire sat in the back, alone. Then Daniel entered. He didn't wear a suit. He wore a gray wool jacket and a button shirt with the sleeves rolled once at the cuffs. No tie, no performance. He looked tired, not defeated, just real. The room quieted instantly. He stood behind the long mahogany table at the front, resting his palms gently on the surface. A few sheets of paper were tucked beneath his hand, a glass of water untouched. "I won't waste your time," he began, voice steady but low. Claire's breath caught in her throat. "Some of you have known me since I was 12, Daniel continued. "Others met me last year. Some believe I've failed you. Some believe I've lied. Maybe I have." He paused, eyes moving across the room. "But there's someone who once told me that truth doesn't need to shout. It only needs to stand." He reached into his coat and lifted a small drive. "This," he said, "is from Mark Whitmore. A man we failed. A husband we failed. A truth that waited too long." Then the screen behind him lit up. Claire held her breath. The video played grainy, time-stamped but clear enough internal meetings showing Lucas Granger pressing for early construction, ignoring safety concerns, falsifying risk assessments. Another slide followed emails between Lucas and third-party contractors, disguising money transfers as site bonuses. Claire's fingers dug into the seat cushion beneath her. And then, finally, a memo dated 3 weeks before the ridge collapse signed only by Lucas. Mark had attached it to his camera card, unknowingly preserving the missing piece. The room fell into a deep, collective silence. Then came the murmurs, the shifting, the sharp inhale of executives suddenly realizing they'd seen these papers before and ignored them. Daniel stepped back. "I should have found this sooner," he said, voice firm now. "I should have asked harder questions. But I didn't." He looked directly at the reporters. "And now, someone else is paying for it. Her name is Claire Whitmore. And she deserves better than what we gave her." There was no applause. Not yet. Just silence, the kind that honored something heavier than words. Claire couldn't move. Tears blurred her vision, but she didn't wipe them away. They weren't just grief, they were release. For Mark. For herself. For the version of Daniel she no longer had to guess about. Later that night, Claire emailed a local journalist. Not a headline chaser, not someone from the big networks. Just a woman named Lena, who had written about the ridge collapse 2 years ago and had been silenced by legal threats. She attached a short note. "You wrote about Mark when no one else did. I think you deserve to finish the story." She didn't sign it. She didn't need to. The next morning, a notification lit up her phone. Breaking Granger. Apprehended at Canadian border. Evidence points to massive corporate fraud cover-up. Claire sat at the kitchen table, the sunlight slowly filling the space around her. It wasn't vindication. It wasn't revenge. It was peace, quiet, steady, and finally, hers. The silence after the chaos is the hardest. It's where you ask, now what? The storm had passed, but the sky didn't clear all at once. There were no big interviews, no declarations, just quiet mornings, unanswered texts, and the soft hum of rebuilding. Claire didn't return to Hartwell Industries. Instead, she found herself at a small nonprofit on the edge of Fairhaven, tucked between a bike repair shop and an old bakery. It worked with widows and families affected by industrial accidents somehow. The mission felt right, not heroic, just necessary. She didn't talk about Mark there, not often, but when she did, it was without bitterness, just memory. 2 mornings a week, she helped Judith catalog books in the small community library they had reopened downtown. It had been closed for years, budget cuts, neglect, but Judith had a way of making forgotten things matter again. Claire loved the quiet in the aisles, the smell of paper and dust, the softness of routine. She hadn't seen Daniel since the meeting. 2 weeks of silence, not coldness, just space. And somehow, that too felt like healing. She'd expected him to call, to text, maybe even stop by, but he didn't. And strangely, she was grateful. It gave her time to walk slower, to sleep deeper, to cry, occasionally, in the middle of folding laundry and not feel like it was a setback. She still kept the book Mark had given her on the nightstand, a journal filled with sketches from when he dreamed of building tree houses for their kids someday. She never opened it, not yet, but she kept it there not as a wound, but as a root. Then, one Thursday morning, with clouds stretching thin across a pale blue sky, the library bell chimed. Claire was reshelving old novels in the corner, wearing a sweater too big for her and her hair in a loose braid. She didn't look up right away, but she recognized the footsteps, steady, measured, familiar in a way that didn't startle her anymore. Daniel stood in front of the checkout desk, holding a small, weathered book in his hands. He looked like he hadn't slept much, but his eyes, they were calm, softened. Claire stepped forward, slow. He didn't say hello. He just placed the book on the desk between them, a cloth-bound cover, the gold lettering barely legible now. The Velveteen Rabbit. "It's the one my mother used to read to me," Daniel said quietly. "I found it in storage last night. Thought maybe you'd like it." Claire touched the cover gently, running her fingers over the frayed corners. It felt like an offering, not of love, but of memory, of something true and lived in. She didn't smile right away. Her chest ached in that slow, full way, like when a song catches you off guard in the middle of an ordinary day. She looked up at him. "I used to think I needed justice," she said softly. Her voice didn't waver. It simply existed in the space between them. But what I really needed was a place to put my trust again. Daniel didn't move. Claire reached across the desk and took his hand. No grand gesture, no dramatic music, just warmth, contact, the kind that says, "I'm here." I stayed. They didn't kiss. They didn't make promises. They just left the library together, walking slowly down the sidewalk lined with maple trees turning golden red. Leaves crunched beneath their feet. The wind moved softly through the branches, whispering through the stillness. Claire glanced sideways as they turned the corner, her hand still in his. And for the first time in a long time, the question wasn't, what if it was simply, what now? And in the quiet, that was enough. Some stories you chase, others, they find you and stay forever. It had been nearly a year. The autumn leaves had returned, rustling against the sidewalk in Fairhaven, like they had that day outside the library. The mornings had grown crisp, the light softer, slower, and Claire was no longer the woman who walked through those office doors with a file in her purse and a heart wrapped in armor. She sat by the window of her small writing room, once Mark's music space, now filled with books, wildflowers, and notes, and typed the final lines of an article she never meant to write. It wasn't investigative journalism. It wasn't a report. It was a memoir of sorts, a story, her story of grief, of anger, of not knowing who to blame, of blaming the wrong person, of learning that sometimes healing isn't about getting answers, it's about learning to ask better questions. She wrote of her first day at Hartwell Industries, the fear, the suspicion, the cold way she looked at everyone, convinced no one could be trusted, not even herself. She wrote of Daniel not as a headline, not as a CEO, not even as a man accused, but as someone who had once lost his mother to silence and had spent a lifetime trying not to become the silence himself. She wrote about the way trust doesn't arrive like thunder. It comes like a leaf falling in the wind, soft, barely noticed, and by the time you see it, it's already at your feet. She didn't write to redeem anyone. She didn't need to. She wrote because the ache in her chest had finally found words, and because maybe someone else, somewhere, needed to know that moving forward didn't mean leaving love behind. The title was simple: The Story I Never Meant to Write. But the editors had added a subtitle. Secretary tried to expose the Millionaire CEO, but fell for the man. She wanted to destroy. She chuckled when she saw it, shook her head, then let it stay. Because, in a strange way, it was true. She had gone there to uncover a villain. Instead, she had met a man who didn't need saving, just someone who saw the light still flickering inside him. And perhaps, more importantly, she had learned to see it inside herself. The article went live on a Sunday morning. By noon, it had been shared across blogs, newsletters, support groups, not because it was scandalous, but because it was honest, quiet, and somewhere between the spaces, it made people feel a little less alone. Messages trickled in: widows, daughters, men who had stayed silent after loss, people who hadn't trusted anyone in years, writing simply, "Thank you. I didn't know I needed this." Claire didn't answer them all, but she read every single one and cried. Not the kind of tears that grief brings sharp, cold, jagged, but the kind that fall slowly because something finally softened inside you. That afternoon, she closed her laptop and looked out the window. Daniel stood across the street, leaning against the railing, a dog-eared book in his hand. The sun cast gentle shadows on his face. He didn't wave, he didn't smile, he just waited, like he always had? Claire grabbed her sweater, slipped on her boots, and walked out into the light. As she reached him, he tucked the book into his coat pocket and held out his hand not in expectation, but in quiet invitation. She took it, and as they walked, leaves crunching beneath their steps, the world moving just slow enough to notice, Claire whispered a thought she hadn't planned to say aloud. Sometimes, she said, the people we once feared, Daniel glanced at her, end up being the ones who help us believe again. He didn't say anything. He just held her hand a little tighter, and in that still, golden silence, they kept walking. Sometimes, healing doesn't come from answers. It comes from choosing to live with the questions. Claire's story reminds us that grief is not something we conquer. It's something we carry, quietly, until it no longer weighs us down, but shapes who we become. In life, we're often quick to assign blame, to protect ourselves by drawing lines between right and wrong. But people are rarely that simple. Even those we distrust may hold more pain than malice. And sometimes, the person we fear might be the one who helps us believe again. Forgiveness, as this story shows, is not weakness, it's an act of courage. Trusting again, after betrayal or loss, is not foolish, it's a way forward. The past doesn't always give us closure, but it can give us clarity. And with clarity comes a softer kind of strength, the kind that allows us to move on without forgetting, to love again without guilt, and to let hope in, even when it knocks on our door quietly. Because some stories don't end. They begin again with gentler hearts and steadier hands. Thank you for spending your time with this story. If it touched your heart, even in the smallest way, we hope you'll pass it on. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Shining Stories, where every story is told to heal, to connect, and to remind us that we're never alone. We'll be here with the next one, waiting for you.